Flora, Indiana, is a small, quiet town where most people know each other. The community is tight-knit, the kind of place where neighbors check in on one another and families grow up surrounded by familiar faces. It was here that Gaylin Rose, a dedicated single mother, worked tirelessly to give her four daughters the best life she could. Gaylin was known for her strong work ethic and deep love for her children. She worked two jobs, constantly juggling long hours to provide for her family. Despite her exhausting schedule, she always made time for her daughters. She was described as selfless, hardworking, and full of love, ensuring that her children never felt alone or unsupported. Her daughters, Kiana Davis, 11, Kiara Phillips, 9, Carol McDonald, 7, and Keone Welch, 5, were the center of her world. Each child had a unique personality, but they were all bright, kind, and full of energy. Kiana, the oldest, was responsible and mature beyond her years. She often helped her mother with her younger siblings and was a natural leader. Kiara, just 2 years younger, had an outgoing personality. She loved to talk and make friends, always keeping the family entertained. Cariel, at 7, had a passion for dance. She would twirl around the house, practicing moves she had learned from watching cheerleading routines. Keone, the youngest at just 5 years old, was the baby of the family. She adored her older sisters and looked up to them. Her innocence and joy brought laughter into their home. Gaylin was not just raising her daughters, she was shaping them into strong young girls, teaching them the importance of kindness, hard work, and family. She did her best to give them a normal childhood, despite the challenges of being a single mother working multiple jobs. Their lives weren't always easy, but their home was filled with love. The girls were active in school activities, sports, and cheerleading. They loved to dance and perform, always practicing their routines together. The sisters were inseparable, and no matter what was going on in their lives, they had each other. But despite the love inside their home, life wasn't without its challenges. Gaylin's father had recently returned to the family after serving time in prison. His presence in the home added another layer of complexity, but to the girls, he was simply their grandfather. They were happy to have him back, and he cherished the time he spent with them. It seemed like things were falling into place, until that night in November 2016, when everything changed. The fire that broke out in their home that night would devastate the community, leaving a mother without her children and a town searching for answers. But the tragedy wouldn't just be about loss. It would become one of the most haunting and unresolved cases in Indiana's history. Gaylin Rose had always done everything in her power to give her daughters a stable life. But things became more complicated when her father, Paul Phillips, re-entered the picture. He had recently been released from prison, and while his past wasn't something Gaylin liked to talk about, she still believed in family. Paul had a criminal record that raised concerns among those who knew the family. His presence in the household was a subject of debate within the community. Some saw it as a chance for him to rebuild his life, while others felt uneasy about his return. But to Gaylin, he was still her father, and she allowed him to stay in the home, at least temporarily. For the four girls, their grandfather's return was a mix of curiosity and excitement. They didn't know much about his past, only that he had been away for a long time. To them, he was another adult in the house, someone who could tell stories and spend time with them while their mother worked her long shifts. Despite Paul's presence, Gaylin maintained her strict work schedule, juggling two jobs to provide for the family. She worked long nights at a nursing home and often came home exhausted, but she never let fatigue get in the way of caring for her daughters. She would come home, cook, help them with homework, and listen to their stories about school and friends. The girls were deeply involved in their extracurricular activities. Kiana and Kiara loved sports, often running around the yard playing games, while Carol and Keone were drawn to dance and cheerleading. Their school community adored them, and teachers often praised their energy, kindness, and strong bond as sisters. At home, things seemed to be going fine, at least on the surface. But there were small signs that not everything was as it seemed. Gaylin's mother, who lived elsewhere, reportedly had concerns about Paul's return. Some family members and friends noticed that Gaylin had been under more stress lately. She still worked tirelessly, but she seemed more cautious, as if she was dealing with something she wasn't ready to talk about. Neighbors later recalled seeing Paul around the house, sometimes interacting with the children. other times keeping to himself. No one could have predicted that within a matter of days, tragedy would strike in the most horrific way imaginable. The night of November 21st, 2016, started like any other. The girls were home, likely winding down from the day. Gaylin, as usual, was working a late shift. None of them could have known that this would be their last night together. What happened next would leave the town of Flora in shock. A fire, one that would be described as both devastating and suspicious, would consume the home within minutes. And by the time it was over, 4 young lives would be lost. It was a cold autumn night in Flora, Indiana. The day had been routine for Gaylin Rose and her 4 daughters. The girls had spent their evening at home, likely finishing up schoolwork, playing, and winding down for bed. Gaylin tucked them in and told them good night before heading to her own bedroom. A peaceful night soon turned into an unimaginable tragedy. At approximately 3:30 a.m., Gaylin was startled awake by thick smoke and the terrifying sound of her daughter screaming. Disoriented and struggling to breathe, she quickly realized the house was on fire. Flames were spreading rapidly, and smoke was filling every corner of their home. Desperate to save her daughters, Gaylin attempted to reach their rooms, but the smoke was overwhelming and the heat was unbearable. Every path she took was blocked by thick black smoke and raging flames. She tried to navigate through the darkness, calling out to her daughters, but she was forced back by the intensity of the fire. Her screams mixed with theirs, but the distance between them was filled with thick, choking smoke and flames growing stronger by the second. Realizing she couldn't reach them, she ran to call 911. Gaylin's panicked voice was the first cry for help. The Flora Fire Department was dispatched immediately, and within minutes, emergency responders arrived. The first police officer on the scene tried to enter the home, guided by Gaylin's frantic explanations of where her daughters were inside. However, the fire had already taken over. The heat and smoke made it impossible to reach the children. Firefighters fought through the flames as neighbors stood outside, helpless. Some tried to assist, but the fire was too intense. The house was fully engulfed within minutes. Trapped inside, the 4 little girls never made it out. As firefighters worked to extinguish the blaze, Gaylin stood outside in shock, overcome with grief and disbelief. She had tried everything to save her children. She had been inside with them, heard their voices, and tried to reach them, but the fire was too strong. By the time the flames were controlled, the bodies of all 4 girls were found inside. The once loving home was reduced to ashes, and a small town was left mourning an unimaginable loss. At first, authorities assumed it was a tragic accident, an electrical fire or a heating malfunction. But as investigators examined the scene, they noticed something unusual. The fire had spread too quickly for a typical accidental blaze. The burn patterns and intensity suggested something much more sinister. Within 48 hours, forensic experts and investigators determined that the fire was intentionally set. This was not an accident. This was arson. The revelation shocked the town. What had seemed like a heartbreaking house fire was now a crime scene. Someone had deliberately set the fire, knowing 4 innocent children were inside. The next phase of the investigation would take a dark and frustrating turn, with suspicion, unanswered questions, and a search for justice. With the fire extinguished and the tragic loss of Kiara, Cariely, and Kiani confirmed, investigators immediately turned their attention to determining what had caused the blaze. Initially, authorities believed it could have been an accidental fire, possibly due to faulty wiring or a space heater malfunction. However, as fire marshals and forensic teams examined the scene, it became clear that this was no accident, it was arson. Fire investigators detected accelerants at multiple points inside the house, indicating that the fire had been deliberately started and spread quickly to block any means of escape. The damage patterns showed that flames had originated in different locations, further confirming that this was not a natural fire. The realization that someone had intentionally set the fire, knowing 4 children were inside, sent shockwaves through Flora and beyond. This was no longer just a tragedy, it was a homicide investigation. Authorities classified the deaths of all 4 girls as homicides. However, despite the urgency of the case, the investigation quickly hit roadblocks. Despite the evidence pointing to arson, authorities struggled to identify a suspect. Law enforcement agencies, including the Indiana State Police and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, ATF, were called in to assist in the investigation. However, as days turned into weeks, there were no arrests, no official suspects, and no clear answers. Forensic evidence was analyzed, including potential DNA, fingerprints, and surveillance footage from nearby areas, but investigators did not publicly reveal any major findings. Some questioned whether someone close to the family could have been responsible, while others speculated about possible connections to past criminal activity in the area. As time passed without any breakthroughs, frustration grew within the Flora community. A case involving the murder of 4 young children should have been a top priority, yet no one had been charged. Residents organized vigils, marches, and social media campaigns demanding justice for the victims. Gaylin Rose, the girl's mother, publicly pleaded for answers. She had narrowly escaped the fire herself and had witnessed the horror unfold firsthand. She wanted to know who had taken her children from her and why. The investigation took a controversial turn when allegations of mishandling emerged. Some believed that law enforcement wasn't doing enough, while others feared that crucial evidence had been lost or ignored. There were also concerns that the case wasn't receiving the same level of media attention and resources as similar tragedies in larger cities. As investigators combed through possible motives and suspects, one name stood out: Gaylin Rose, the girl's grandfather. Glenn had a criminal record and had recently been released from prison, where he had served time for crimes unrelated to the fire. Some community members speculated whether his past could have played a role in the arson, either as an act of revenge against the family or due to unresolved conflicts. Despite this suspicion, no concrete evidence linked Gaylin Rose to the crime. He denied any involvement, and authorities never publicly named him, or anyone else, as a suspect. Desperate for leads, authorities eventually enlisted the help of the FBI. The case was officially classified as arson homicide, and a $5,000 reward was offered for information leading to an arrest. Yet despite the resources, tips, and investigative efforts, the case remained unsolved. With no arrests, no named suspect, and more questions than answers, the community was left wondering who was responsible and whether justice would ever be served. In the months and years following the Flora House fire, the town struggled to recover from the loss of Kiana, Kiara, Cariel, and Kiani Rose. Their deaths were not only a heartbreaking tragedy, but also a painful reminder that someone out there knew the truth. Someone had deliberately set the fire that took their lives. Yet despite an ongoing investigation and involvement from multiple law enforcement agencies, no arrests were ever made. Gaylin Rose, the girl's mother, had survived the fire but was left with emotional scars that would never heal. She had tried to save her daughters that night, but the flames had spread too quickly. She had also spoken to the first officer on the scene, trying to guide him to the girl's bedroom, but the thick smoke and intense heat prevented any rescue. In the years that followed, Gaylin publicly expressed her frustration over the lack of answers. She pleaded for justice for her daughters, appearing at vigils and speaking to the press. She repeatedly asked authorities for updates but felt like progress in the case had stalled. The fact that no one had been arrested, despite clear evidence of arson, only deepened the pain. Gaylin struggled to understand why someone would target her home and take her children away from her. As time passed without an arrest, speculation continued to grow. Community members, journalists, and even some law enforcement officials questioned whether critical mistakes had been made early in the investigation. One major concern was the handling of the crime scene. There were rumors that potential evidence had been lost or mishandled. Some wondered if investigators had overlooked key details that could have identified the arsonist. Others questioned whether the case was receiving the same level of urgency as other high-profile crimes. Comparisons were drawn to the Delphi murders, another Indiana case that gained nationwide attention. Some Flora residents felt that authorities were not prioritizing the fire investigation in the same way, despite the clear evidence of foul play. The controversy deepened when Carroll County's fire chief resigned in 2017. He claimed that the Indiana State Police had mishandled the case and failed to release critical information to the public. His resignation raised even more concerns about transparency and accountability in the investigation. The Indiana State Police and FBI continued to work on the case, but as the years went by, little new information was released. Authorities maintained that the fire was intentionally set and that they were still searching for the person responsible, but no one was ever charged. Several key questions remained unanswered. Who set the fire and why? Was it a targeted attack on the family, or was it random? Had the person responsible confessed to someone or left behind clues that hadn't been found? Authorities continued to encourage the public to come forward with tips, but leads grew cold, and media coverage of the case faded over time. Despite the lack of arrests, the Flora community never stopped fighting for justice. Every year on the anniversary of the fire, vigils and memorials were held in honor of the four girls. Their classmates, teachers, and neighbors kept their memory alive through fundraisers, awareness campaigns, and social media efforts. The $5,000 reward for information leading to an arrest remained unclaimed, but many hoped that one day someone would come forward with the truth. As of today, the Flora House fire remains an open and unsolved case. The Indiana State Police continue to urge anyone with information to step forward. The Flora community still seeks closure and accountability, knowing that somewhere out there, the person responsible for the deaths of four innocent girls has yet to be held accountable. For Gaylin Rose, life will never be the same. She lost everything that mattered in that fire. The pain of that night, the memories of her daughters, and the fight for justice remain with her every single day. Until an arrest is made, the Flora fire case will remain one of Indiana's most haunting unsolved tragedies, a case that demands answers, justice, and the truth. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications to be notified as we upload new crime stories daily. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.